Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're very excited to have you all and really are appreciative of you carving out some time to sit in on this conversation we're going to have. My name is Carlos Guerrero. I'm a business development executive over here at 360 Advanced, and we're lucky enough to have Mike Parisi with HITRUST and Ryan Winkler, one of our practice directors. And I'll let them introduce themselves in a second, but and I'm going to kind of do some business in the beginning as we kind of get things kicked off. I would like to say that during this conversation, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. And if we can't get to them today during our conversation, then we will certainly reach out to you afterwards and try to provide answers to those. So a couple of things that we're going to be talking about today, just a quick agenda. I'm going to share with you some of the upcoming webinars that we're going to do. We do webinars monthly, so you'll know what's coming up. Let the panelists introduce themselves and share, their credentials and their story, and then we'll have a general discussion. We're going to talk in sort of a podcast format around several topics that tie into compliance and security broadly and how they pertain to HITRUST. And then Mike's going to walk through some of the updates to the HITRUST assessment portfolio. So if you want to go to the next slide. So quick elevator pitch, 360 Advanced. So we are a cybersecurity audit and compliance firm, probably about 80 people or so, headquartered here in St. Pete, Florida. We're an integrated compliance shop, so along with HITRUST, we're helping folks with SOC 2, ISO 27001, PCI, some penetration testing, some managed services. The overall gist of our type of firm is that we like to, help make better businesses, and we feel like we can do that best through, helping you, achieve your compliance objectives. So you can go ahead to the next slide. Just some of the seals that I mentioned. We have lots of if it's cybersecurity compliance, we probably have done it or do it. So, all right. So let's do a quick introduction to our wonderful panel. Mike, I'm going to let you start, and then share as much of your story as you'd like, and then Ryan, you can do the same.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. Hear me okay? All right, yeah. Great. Welcome, everyone. So Mike Parisi, I am a Vice President of Adoption here at HITRUST. I've been here for almost 6 years, May will be 6 years. My role is really focused on market education and working with organizations that are considering adopting not just the HITRUST framework, but going down the HITRUST path or journey, and talking about the benefits of that process, in addition to working with a number of our partners, like 360, that has been a longtime partner of ours, and love doing these types of things with them, and looking forward to today's discussion. I grew up on the East Coast in the New York area, and I split time between there and San Jose, California, which is where I'm joining you from today. So great to meet everyone.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. Ryan?
Hi everybody. My name is Ryan Winkler, practice director here at 360 Advanced. I've been here for about 7 years now, and was really, the one that helped build our HITRUST program here at 360. My background really entails being in the healthcare industry. Before I was with 360 Advanced, I was an Optum employee through acquisition, worked with United Health Group. And my main role was to help ensure we were in compliance with our business process outsourcing division. And a lot of my background is in HIPAA, and just took a niche with helping safeguard EPHI. And as I moved through the ranks and moved to 360 Advanced, I branched out into other standards, SOC 2 and PCI and ISO 27001. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today, and excited to see where it leads.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Ryan. And I should share with everyone, Ryan, that you are on the External Assessor Council as well with HITRUST. And so
yes,
you've been a part of this.
One of my counterparts too, Chelsea Higgins, is our QA manager, is also on the council with us. So yeah, really excited about that, and really excited to be able to contribute our thoughts and ideas to help better improve the HITRUST ecosystem.
Wonderful. No, that's great. Go ahead to the next one. So quick, preview of the webinars to come. So In March, we're going to launch our 360 Cyber Comply program. So in that particular webinar, we're going to share with you what is all entailed with this managed services offering that I spoke to you about. So we'll be going to that in detail. And then after that, in April, we'll do a pen testing webinar, and then we'll do ISO 27001 after that. And make sure you go to our website. We've posted all of our previous webinars there. You can check out the many compliance and security topics that we've been sharing. And again, ask questions today. So let's get things kicked off. Mike, I'm just going to kind of pose this to you. A lot of times, folks, even when they come to us, they think about compliance, HITRUST, or any framework or certification or attestation as a product, right? Like, hey, how can I get my certification? I mean, I think I'd like to ask you to put like this in the context of HITRUST being a risk management framework, and how it's a little bit more than just that piece of paper you get at the end of an assessment.
Yeah, Carlos. So this may shock some people when I say this, but what I like to say is certification should be the last thing, right, on everyone's mind. It's great if you can achieve it, right? But the more important thing, I think, is, as you mentioned, is really building out an appropriate enterprise risk management program. And there's a number of things that sit under that umbrella, if you will. Which is understanding inherent risk within your own organization, with your third parties, understanding the level of residual risk, understanding how to make certain management decisions, and building an appropriate information security and really cybersecurity program, right? So where we started, when HITRUST started a number of years ago, we weren't a certifying body. Now, what we started with was the framework, as you mentioned, and helping organizations, as Ryan knows, United was one of our first partners, helping organizations manage risk more efficiently and more effectively. It wasn't until after that we added on the assurance program and said, well, why don't we allow for organizations to obtain a certification if they meet minimum necessary thresholds relative to program maturity. But when you look at a number of our customers, over 50% of our customers are adopters of the framework, and they haven't even achieved certification yet. So maybe a little bit of a mindset, because when most organizations hear about HITRUST, they say, well, I'm racking and stacking certs, and it's just another thing to add to the list. So it's a mind shift, and really how you unlock the value of the programs that we built is to adopt and help you to more efficiently and more effectively manage risk and get further transparency into how you're doing that. And as I like to say, compliance is an outcome, but security is a mission, right? And we're focused on really supporting that mission of security.
That's beautiful. And Ryan, maybe speak a little bit about, your conversations with, some of your clients and some of your business partners about the difference of, understanding a culture of risk management as opposed to, hey, this is just a, certification.
Yeah, I see the HITRUST program. A lot of times, you get a prospect that reaches out to you, says, I need HITRUST certification, but one thing that sometimes we fail to realize is that there's a lot of benefit in having HITRUST as a risk management framework. And one thing I noticed is that organizations that embrace the methodology of the risk management framework set forth at HITRUST they're also more likely to get certified by actually truly adopting that program. And a lot of the times it's a separate question I get asked sometimes on the same call is, well, how do I start managing risks in my organization? And I don't know where to start. Well, HITRUST is a great starting point when it comes to figuring out how to identify and manage and measure and optimize risk. The methodology is there, it's set for you. There's already a scoring model in place. My CSF really helps drive a lot of the processes. And at the end of the day, there is a built-in workflow that takes a lot of the guessing work out of, determining how your security posture is compared to compliance in your organization. And I think that one thing I think which we should really capitalize on regarding HITRUST is half the work is done for you when it comes to figuring out what is my risk tolerance, what is my risk methodology.
No, that's excellent. I think this kind of can actually transition into the next slide, and I think you'll see where I'm going. And so I think, Mike, as we hand it back to you, not only organizations that have never done HITRUST and they're starting their journey, but how does that sort of parallel even the journey of HITRUST, like you said, is sort of supporting these security programs and helping making businesses better. Like how do you think about that in terms of a journey?
Yeah, and I think we'll get into a little bit, we'll get into that a little bit more as we move on when we talk about the expansion of the portfolio, because that's part of the journey that we've had, right, from our own organization. I guess maybe just to add a little commentary onto Ryan's last comments as we transition into this, there's value in validated assurances, right? I think we all know that, right? So I think as a society, and for those of us that have kids, your kids always want to get the trophy and win first place and be on the honor roll. But the reality is the value of the exercising of the mind that they have when they go through school, being part of a team sport, for example, learning those skills. You don't always have to get the trophy and you don't always have to be number one. Now equate that back to the journey. You don't have to go from zero to certification, right? I think the real value in providing assurances, and I'm working with somebody like 360 as your partner to do that level of validation, is that you got somebody objective and independent that is helping to provide assurances over what you're doing from an information security program. So again, don't be so focused on certification. Start your journey with adopting the framework, as Ryan mentioned. One of the exercises that I've always advised organizations to do is to do a level of rationalization internally, right? And a number of our partners like 360, these are projects or workshops that they can run. Look at everything that you're doing within your organization, right? All the different types of assurances, and ask yourself the question, or with the help of somebody like Ryan or Carlos, do you really need to be doing all those different activities? There's probably opportunities to normalize a little bit. And the way that you can do that is it could be maybe eliminating certain activities that aren't adding value, or it could be leveraging a different approach, like leveraging the HITRUST CSF that maps to 40 different, authoritative sources, leading with that and then pivoting and producing the reporting that you need to do. So I would say start your journey with understanding where you are today and what you need. And then from there, understand what it means to traverse along a maturity scale or program. What you want is you want to be able to measure today, and you want to be able to measure as you continue to mature and where you need to go. And then measure along that way and in the future. And the framework is designed to do that. The assurance program is designed to do that. And the portfolio itself is designed to do that. I think what we recognized, and we'll get into this a little more later, is HITRUST is a high bar. It's not easy by design, right? It's hard by design. And that's really rooted in all the different authoritative sources that are underneath. I mean, how many conversations, Ryan, have we had with customers with like, well, why do I need to do that requirement? Well, don't blame us. That's because NIST 853 is telling you that you need to do that requirement, right? But as you start your journey, it is really a journey, and it's not a checkbox exercise, and it's something that you need to care for and nurture and water. When we started at the highest level, which is kind of the opposite. Right. And as some of my colleagues like to say, achieving what was the HITRUST certification was a significant emotional event. And it was pretty hard for a number of organizations. So we recognized on our journey that we needed to meet organizations where they were and give them a destination right through that journey by allowing them to take bites of the apple or steps along the way, which has manifested itself in the expansion of our portfolio that we'll talk about a little further on.
Excellent. One of the words that you said that really caught my mind, and Ryan, you can expand upon this, but the word mindset, it sounds like it's just more of a sort of cultural adoption. I'm certainly certain there's a amount of tone at the top that's important, but it really does take a shift in thinking to really get the most out of this experience. I mean, what would you say, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, it starts at the top, and it's a you have to embrace the culture, and that starts at the highest levels. And in order for that to traverse down, we have to have agreements at all levels of the top. A lot of the times what happens is it becomes more of a marketing effort and less of a way to manage risk. And the tone at that point, it's sometimes it can be hard at lower levels then at that point to really manage the program, because you don't have that high level support, that embracing the compliance and the risk management aspects of it. I think that's really important. And then, a lot of the times what I see happen is, we'll do a high trust assessment, an I1, R2, either one, and we'll come back to do the next assessment, and the program is falling apart. There's not a lot of stuff still in place, and it's because of losing sight of the fact that HITRUST is a program that has to be maintained over time, and there's a lot of management that goes involved with any risk management program. So if we can change our mindset to embrace it more of a risk management and allow us to provide a level of third-party assurance, I think that'll help us be more well-rounded and getting through to the HITRUST journey, and not having a stopping point and having gaps.
Perfect. No, that's excellent. Let's go ahead and move on to the next topic. So compliance versus security. I mean, this is an age-old sort of question. I mean, there's certainly areas of overlap, certainly areas of sort of push and pull, but maybe speak to, compliance versus security, Mike, from HITRUST's perspective. Like, what are some of the conversations that you guys are having, behind closed doors, and how these, two, specific disciplines overlap?
Yeah, it's a great question. I alluded to this before, with compliance being an outcome, security being a mission, right? So what we're focused on is really helping organizations to build effective information security, privacy, cybersecurity programs, and then allowing them to provide assurances over the maturity of those programs. If you treat HITRUST like a compliance exercise, you're not going to recognize the full value of it, and you're not going to fully embrace and adopt, right, the different elements of the programs. And frankly, you probably aren't going to end up with the result that you want, right? And I think Ryan can certainly speak to this. Organizations that we've seen as looking at it as a check-the-box exercise, oftentimes will end up with lower maturity scores, and oftentimes will not result in certification, right, once they submit for certification, because it's not designed to be a compliance exercise. Although certain compliance factors and standards are included within the overall framework, it's more than just that. So if you look at the structure of the framework itself, as you guys know, when I talk about this concept of authoritative sources, I put those into different categories. So those authoritative sources could be other risk management or controls-based frameworks, not necessarily compliance, right? Things, for example, like COSO, COBIT, different flavors of NIST, et cetera. It certainly includes the second bucket, regulations, which can lead to compliance, if you will. And those elements may be, for example, if we're thinking about federal or international standards, GDPR, obviously, right, Singapore Data Privacy Protection, and then federal, for example, if we think about HIPAA, and if we think about statutory regulations like CCPA, et cetera, and others. And then there are other standards, so things like PCI, FedRAMP, et cetera. So if you're looking at just compliance, this is not for you. And the reality is you really shouldn't be looking at just compliance. You should be looking at managing security, which results in an outcome of appropriate compliance. So although it is an age-old debate, it is also a change in thought process. And in talking to a number of organizations that have adopted HITRUST, especially during the pandemic, for example, you know, there was a great article today that came out on Extelligent Media where they talked about how during that time, organizations needed to onboard a number of new vendors and third parties that they never had to work with before. And so that exploded overnight. And when you talk to a number of the CISOs that were in that position, they said, well, how did you deal with that? And there were some that said, well, hair was on fire, right? I couldn't believe that happened. I had to let it in the door because I was focused on saving lives, and I'll go back to it later to figure out the exposure, as opposed to those that were HITRUST adopters. So I'm not worried because I have all the appropriate information security programs in place and the appropriate processes in place to manage risk. So therefore, you know, I'm confident in terms of the steps that I need to take and ensuring I continue to be compliant. So it is an age-old debate, but compliance is something that we need to get off of thinking that it's a check-the-box exercise and more of an outcome of our mission, which should be information security.
Makes complete sense. Ryan, I have a question here that I'd like to ask, and kind of like we like to answer a couple questions right in the middle, and I think this would be a good one for you, you know, based on your position and what you do at 360. But and I know this is a broad question, so you know, be as condensed as you can. But how do you determine scope for HITRUST? And again, I know that's a big question, but maybe just point some people in some directions who might have that kind of question.
Yeah, no, that's honestly, it's a great question. It's a question that gets asked a lot. And I think, you know, it really starts with identifying your, you know, one thing to know is that HITRUST certifies implemented systems. And, you know, you would really want to start with where's the data lie? And kind of, you know, peeling back the layers of the onion from there, like so to say. So, you know, and then identifying too, okay, where's the data? Okay, well, what are all the assets that are, you know, this data is being stored on, and then what's transmitting that data, and kind of just, you know, opening the ball to, you know, figuring out what's your universe. And then you want to make sure too that you identify areas of, you know, that could be potentially be compromised, attack vectors that can be used to, you know, shimmy into, you know, your processing environment. But I would say the scope starts with the data, and then identifying and knowing from a logical perspective what can touch that data, who can touch that data, and branching it out from there.
It's a great explanation, especially for folks that are, I imagining, you know, considering HITRUST. I mean, that is a really important question.
And there's a lot of unique scenarios when it comes to that too. You know, one of the most common questions I get asked is, hey, my entire environment's hosted in AWS, and we have 3 satellite locations. Do we need to include our physical satellite locations in scope? Well, anyone in the audit world would say it depends. And in the sense that, you know, what's the level of connectivity between your AWS environment in that location? Is it, you know, could that location be potentially used as an attack vector to gain a hold of that environment? And if it can be, then it should be included in your scope. But for instance, if it's just like being at a Starbucks and just working out of a satellite location, and there's no connectivity, then maybe, you know, you have a justification to not include that in your scope.
That's great. Excellent. Let's just for, you know, to keep us on time, let's head on to the next one. I love this question because, one, I like things that are disruptive and things that are change and progress, right? And I think that this concept that, Mike, you started talking about in the very beginning of this being a mindset, you know, I think really plays into this, because the mindset is, I would believe, and what I hear is HITRUST is healthcare related, right? But I would imagine that the folks at HITRUST are having conversations about, bigger topics, and more conceptual things of how, you could help businesses of all types. And I'd be really curious to hear your feedback on that.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite ones, an age-old conversation and debate. So I guess I'll start with a transition from Ryan's comments. From a scope perspective, it really depends on what your mission is, and I think it dovetails nicely into this, right? Certainly you want to understand the contractual obligations, but when you look at the elements of scope from a HITRUST standpoint, there's a lot of flexibility and a lot to unpack there. So it's certainly elements of your environment, right? Whether that be infrastructure, systems, applications, et cetera, locations. But then there's elements of what types of business processes are you offering, right, from an organizational perspective. And then, of course, there's the compliance or regulatory factors as well. And what that does is, when I say it depends on what your mission is, it really also depends on what industry you're in and who your stakeholder is. So when you look at all the authoritative sources that are in the framework, remember it's 40 plus. Only one is HIPAA. Only one is HIPAA, right? When you look at all the other authoritative sources, with the exception of maybe a few around CMMC, but the majority of them are industry agnostic for a reason. I think a lot of organizations forget that, right? When you look at everything that's in there. It's designed to help you build and provide assurances over your information security program, period. In addition to that, that could be regardless of what industry you're in. So there is a perception, there has been for a number of years, and I think we continue to overcome that, and so does the market. Less than 30% of our customers and certified organizations are traditional covered entities from a healthcare perspective, right? To give you an idea. The majority of those is what would be, in the healthcare speak, business associates or vendors. But if you look at the industries that they're in tech, right? They're in cloud, they're BPO, they're ITO. A lot of them are financial services. So we've got some pretty specific, interesting use cases. For example, we've been working with a very large aluminum manufacturer, right, who has plants. I mean, these guys don't know how to spell HIPAA, but why are they looking to use HITRUST? Well, because they need to provide validated assurances, and they're interested in providing a certification over NIST 800-171, because they're going to be doing business with federal contractors subject to DOD and subject to CMMC, right? That's a use case that you typically wouldn't think of. I had a call with a federal credit union, earlier this week that said, hey, we got to provide compliance over NIST and FFIEC, and somebody wants us to do a SOC 2 instead of doing 3 separate audits. Why can't I use the HITRUST framework work with a partner and then produce the various reporting I need to do? So it is relevant to all industries. And when you look at what we've done with the portfolio, for example, with the I1 certification, that is derived from NIST 800-171. It's not healthcare specific. And further, when you look at the new E1 certification, that's derived from cybersecurity essentials, right? 8 different sources that are certainly relevant to healthcare, but are really meant to be industry agnostic. So I say all that to say, even if you're not a healthcare organization, you're not doing business within healthcare, it's something to highly consider. And a series of other examples that we have that we could share, might be relevant. But think about it in terms of the authoritative sources, the framework, the process that's in place, and the concept of bringing it back to validated assurances is an industry agnostic need.
Now that's great. And just as you were talking about that, someone asked a question, or actually right before, and they said that they asked, does HITRUST, map directly to NIST? I mean, that was their, that was their question. I mean, Ryan, it's a little probably, Michael mentioned multiple, frameworks and different sources, but I mean, NIST is certainly a large component.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I really love about, the high trust, program and, in the use of MyCSF in itself is it makes it really easy to do one assessment and then reporting the outcome in one report. There is, the good thing is it takes all the guesswork out. You select, the regulatory factors that you're required or that you have to provide a level of assurance with. And it all just gets put into one assessment and you can assess it all at once. So, I could, maybe if I'm operating a SaaS platform and I have to be compliant with GDPR and CCPA and maybe also HIPAA. Well, although there's a lot of like components to those three regulations, right? And if I select all three of them, the good thing is they're all harmonized for me already. And I think that really takes a lot of the work away, even in the assessor community, of having to, I decipher all the different changes and differences.
Oh, that's excellent. That's great. Well, let's head on to the next topic. So this is where, we kind of shift into focusing on something very specific. The High Trust folks had some webinars recently launching the updates to the portfolio, and so we wanted to make sure to bring Mike on and have him give some highlights of that, because I think the additions are pretty exciting and are going to add a little bit more of I don't know. There's going to be the ability for more types of organizations to take advantage of high trust, and I think that ties right into some of the things we've been talking about. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So version 11, I've heard Ryan talk about version 11 coming for a minute, and I know that that's been on the roadmap, and but it's here. And so, Mike, do you want to just walk us through a little bit of this slide or anything that you'd like to really call out in terms of, why version 11 is different and what's important about it?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start back with the mission, right? So what were we trying to accomplish? And it was really three different things. One was making the adoption and the assessment against, and ultimately, the certification path easier for organizations to understand and proceed down, right? So that was one mission. How do we remove some of this friction, and how do we make it easier and introduce more transparency into what does it take in order to define the journey? And so that was one. Two was related to one, was to offer organizations differing levels of validated assurances, which could all result in certifications, right, by us and as a certifying body, to either meet them where they are or provide a means to an end in the form of program maturity and traversability, while allowing them to provide, again, validated assurances along that journey. Right? And it could be that journey stops somewhere in the middle, depending upon the risk or what they're doing. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now all of a sudden, if an organization was asked to become high trust certified again, being a one-trick pony for a number of years, they needed to go through the significant emotional event. But when you look at that, there could have been a lot of bloat in there, right? There could have been a lot of things in there that were not relevant to them. Take it back to our last discussion topic. If I'm not a covered entity, or if I'm not a business associate, why am I forced to look at HIPAA controls? Why do I have to do all that work? So part of the updates that we made, not only from a framework perspective, but from a portfolio standpoint, again, was to meet them where they are and to provide a means to an end that was relevant to that organization. The third thing that we really strived to do was to become more relevant from a cyber perspective. That's not to suggest that the frameworks and the standards and the controls and everything that we've normalized were not related to cyber, but we wanted an additional data set or viewpoint that tied into what we can't get away from, right? Every second there's question of, well, what are we doing around cyber threats and risks? And as we know, that's very dynamic. And when you talk about cyber threats that you need to address, and the tactics and the mitigations that you need to have in place, that does not equate to one-for-one controls, right? Very similar to, you need to understand what are the appropriate threats within your organization before you can even build a risk register. Never mind select the controls that you need to put in place to address those risks that ultimately address the threats. And although that was part of our methodology for quite some time, again, it wasn't as transparent in the form of risk and control rationalization from a HITRUST perspective, right? So those were the three goals and missions that we had. And we started to tackle that in bits and pieces throughout the years. We did that in somewhat of a pilot effort last year in introducing our very first certification outside of what was the HITRUST certification that's referred to as the I1, right, the implemented 1 year. And that was our first shot at it. Some things I think we got right, and some things we missed the mark on, frankly, right? I think the I1 continued to be a little too bloated. It still had a little too much HIPAA security rule, if you will. And you can argue, well, if it's supposed to be a moderate step, again, to meet organizations where they are, well, it's still a couple of floors in the skyscraper above where they're comfortable being. So we went through some efforts to reboot that with some invaluable feedback from the community, inclusive of assessed organizations, relying parties, and partners, right, like 360, to say, look, let's tweak it a little bit, right? Let's make it more relevant. And now, this year with the introduction of version 11, everyone kind of freaks out whenever we introduce a new version, as you guys know. I think for the first time in my almost 6 years of being here, version 11 is the first time that it actually addresses a lot of the pain points relative to adoption for organizations and relative to transparency around what is that HITRUST journey, right? So things like getting rid of the evaluative elements that are buried 17 steps down within the CSF to truly understand what do I need to do to satisfy this control. For years, organizations would look at a control and say, well, that's subject to interpretation. I could do one thing and say I'm meeting that control. No, the reality is there's 15 things you need to do underneath that. Where do I find that? Why do I have to click 20 times? And it becomes a little misleading, right? So taking those evaluative elements and putting them right in your face, directly in the control, to say, this is exactly what it means to meet this control, gives more transparency, and it's easier for organizations to understand the expectations, and also where's that derived from a framework perspective. And further, by doing that, by the introduction of version 11, it then allowed us to create mechanisms like additional assurance offerings that are more aligned to the evaluative elements, and then make the entire portfolio and framework cyber threat adaptive, right? We couldn't do that without the introduction of version 11 and really bringing the concept of evaluative elements to the forefront. And I would add, I just had an internal demo on this morning, which is super cool, is we've now introduced elements of AI and automation into our authoritative source mapping. And that also allowed us to do that. It's not chat 3PT, so don't worry, it's not that. What it allows us to do now is to consume a new authoritative source. So if somebody says, well, why isn't this within the framework? We could say, well, let's check it out. Let's see. We can run it through the AI tool and say, well, it looks like we got 80% coverage. Maybe it's a lower lift to incorporate that additional 20% and add authoritative sources. So lots that it's allowed us to do. The traversability is also critical, right? So the fact that now the assessments are nested, as Ryan and Carlos, as you know, when we first introduced the I1, there was this population of controls that you had to do for the I1 that wasn't in the R2. So somebody's looking at it and saying, what gives? Like, why does that exist? Does that mean I'm going to have throwaway when I move to an R2 next year? Yeah, it kind of did. And the reason for that was because the I-1 was cyber threat adapted, but the R2 wasn't, right? So all of that's been fixed. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that in a future slide.
Excellent. No, that's great. And maybe we can just get a preview of the next slide. And Ryan, maybe as we sort of make that transition, maybe talk a little bit about how the the like version 11 and kind of this whole shift in the portfolio is making a difference
Yeah,
with your practice.
Yeah, I know. I'm really excited about this in the sense that a lot of the times we'll work with an organization that's trying to get their build their program up to R2, right? And it might take them, depending on their risk factors, a year and a half, 2 years. Every organization is different. But the problem that we tend to have is that they were being expected to provide a level of assurance or provide assurances throughout that time. And it's hard to demonstrate that when you're working on building the program, when building such a big program. Now, with having additional stepping stones in between, and being able to demonstrate that, it provides a level of assurance even as you're traversing through the portfolio to demonstrate to third parties that you're doing the right thing and you're going up the ranks. So and it also provides for more of a seamless way of moving to the next level. Any organization can start now with the E1 and move their way up, and nothing's lost. Everything is building on top of the other, and it's really going to increase efficiencies and essentially help organizations maintain and increase their levels of compliance in a more streamlined fashion.
How would an organization know like which of these is the right assessment or the right certification for them?
Yeah, so that there's a lot of factors that are involved with that, right? And it really depends on what level of assurances you need to provide, and also depends on the level of risks within your organization. If you're presenting a moderate level of risk, maybe you're not, you don't store or transmit a lot of sensitive data. Maybe the I1 is a better, a better approach than the R2. Or there may be, you may be processing hundreds of thousands of records, and you have your environment does present a lot of risk. Then maybe the R2 would be a better route to go. And the good thing is organizations kind of get to make that decision from a risk-based approach, and it allows them to find a solution that is that provides a high level of assurance, but also provides a level of efficiency that fits their organization.
Excellent, because we know that not everyone on this call work in healthcare related organizations. There's all types of businesses that are, the 100+ people that are joining us today. So it kind of ties back in to that overall, vision that you were talking about, Mike, with, and allowing for multiple paths for folks to go in order to, get that assurance based on their particular needs.
Yeah, and Carlos, can I jump in there? Sorry, this is my soapbox. I love this one. So, most things, I'll give you the old cliche, right? We usually say, well, something is a science or something is not a science. It's an art. I think the question that you asked is critical. Deciding what level you need to be at could be both, either a science or an art, or a combination of both, right? So, for example, there is an inherent risk methodology that many customers, or what we refer to as relying parties, use in order to answer that very question. It's called the risk triage methodology. It's actually part of our third-party risk management methodology, publicly available on our website. We could share that afterward. But that's the science aspect. And the idea behind it is, when you as a vendor, when you go through and you look at these inherent risk factors relative to the scope of services that you're providing your customer, you can answer that question through science in terms of what's the inherent risk that I'm introducing to my customer. Now, that may be different on a customer by customer basis. If Ryan is using more of my services, if I'm processing more of his data, if he's trying to save a buck and he wants me to do it with my offshore team, his risk is going to look very different than Carlos's, right? Who may be doing less data, everything is onshore, et cetera. But there is a bit of a science. That model, and this is what our relying parties, so those that ask for HITRUST certification, this is what they use to answer that question. You could run that model yourself. And you could say the model is coming out with this risk tier, which would recommend to my customer that I, at a minimum, give them an I1, right? Or, well, it looks like if they follow this methodology, they're going to be asking me for an R2. That's one resource that you can use to try and answer that question on the scientific side of the house. Now, if we go to the art side of the house, there's obviously an element of negotiation. So just because you're being asked for HITRUST certification, ask the question, right? Work with a partner like 360 Advanced that says, look, there's 3 different options. It says HITRUST certification. Do I want to play the game and get an E1 and say, well, I have an HITRUST certification? Some organizations do that. I don't know that I would recommend that, but it is something that, you know, has worked for some organizations. But as you go back to the customer and you have an element of negotiation to say, I understand what you're asking me to do. You're asking me to provide you validated assurances and more transparency into my program maturity. I'm on board. I want to do that. However, there's many ways that I can do that. Take a stance. I've thought about it. I've worked with my partner, like 360, and we think this is the right answer, and this is why, right? Maybe I'm not handling significant PHI, I'm handling PII. 800-171 seems to be, you know, a pretty acceptable standard. I don't want to boil the ocean with 853. 171 is a subset of that anyway. This is where I'm going to start. And by the way, it's stronger than maybe a SOC 2 or certainly stronger than a SIG or an information security questionnaire. Mr. or Mrs. Customer, what do you think, right? So there is an element of art and negotiation on that. And further, even if you know you're being asked to do an R2, and maybe they're telling you to do that within 12 months, well, now you can go back and say, look, I'm going to get on the HITRUST train. I hear you, but here's my plan. I can't do it in 12 months. And by the way, do you want me to go away for 12 months and not give you any assurances? How about this? How about I do an E1 within 6 months, and then I do an I1 within a year? And can we meet in the middle and agree that I give you an R2 in 18 months or 2 years? I'm going to give you assurances along the way. I'm leveraging what you want me to leverage. I'm traversing along the portfolio. So that's why I say there's a science to it and there's an art to it. And what I always advise is work with your assessor partners like 360 that have seen the use cases that can help you kind of build those models. So sorry, I needed to expand on that.
That's great. I think that's great. And it goes back to mindset. And I love when people talk about the art and science of anything, because when you blend those together, that's where you get the craft, right? That's where a practice gets developed. And that's where you build something that's just bigger than, you know, one part of this thing, right? And so that's where I think you explained that really well. And so let's go to the next slide. We have, you know, several, 10 minutes or so left. I will say that we're not going to make it through all of these slides, but you will be getting them. So, you know, and a lot of those have come directly from HITRUST. There's a lot of great information in there. And then you'll be receiving some emails from us after this asking you, hey, how did we do? And in those emails, if you want to respond back and, you know, have broader discussions about some of the many questions we've gotten about what maps to HITRUST, then please take advantage of that. So let's just lean into this whole thing, or the concept of being, you know, cyber threat adaptive. Mike, I know that's something that you were real excited about, and let's just have the final bits of our conversation today about that. And Ryan, please chime in along the way.
Sure.
Yeah. So, you know, what do we mean by cyber threat adaptive? Sounds like a fancy term, right? So this is what it really means. and you can see some of the points on here. So we're working with a number of cyber threat intel providers, right, for which many organizations probably are. So getting feeds of what are the most common IoTs, IOCs, et cetera. And we're taking that a step further. We're looking at that information, and through our close partnership with MITRE, which is the most widely adopted resource, if you will, from a cyber perspective, what the federal government uses. We're then further identifying what are the appropriate tactics and mitigations associated with those, and then mapping that, again, in conjunction with our partnerships, to which controls out of the CSF are associated with those cyber threats. Now, there's over 2,000 controls in the CSF. They're not all going to be. As we know, there's a lot of controls in there that are specific to a compliance standard or an authoritative source that, if you ask my opinion, are way outdated, especially CMMC. We'll put that aside for a second, and some of the CMS stuff as well. But what we've then done is to say, well, how do we make this dynamic? Because as we know, a number of the standards and controls that are in place for, say, 10 years and never get updated, they're not cyber threat adaptive. We're still talking about degaussing tapes. I mean, God help us. We should be seriously rethinking our lives, right? But that stuff exists. So we said we want to make it dynamic. So on a quarterly basis, we refresh the control set, where some may come out because if they're not relevant from a cyber threat perspective anymore, then why do we need to be doing them? And some may come in, right, if it's a new threat from a landscape perspective. And this really allows organizations where at any point in time, you're addressing over 95% of the most common cyber threats that are out there. As you can imagine, the ones that we're primarily focused on today, MFA, phishing, ransomware, we're all tired of hearing it, but those are the ones. So when you look at something like the E1, which by the way only has 44 controls, right? Not for anyone to throw to, get out of their seat, but 44 controls, that's it. And they're focused on the most common cyber threats and risks. That's what we mean by cyber threat adaptive. And it used to be just the I1, and now it's the entire portfolio and the entire framework. So any assessment you do, you have not only validated assurances, but insight into what cyber threats and risks you are addressing as a result of that implementation, those assurances.
Yep. I also think, one great thing about it is it's almost an extra quiver in your hat, so to say, in the sense that you're now providing a level of additional assurance that, you are, meeting you're addressing the threats of today. Not a compliance standard that was developed 10 years ago. And that's I feel like that's big. It also helps with just knowing today. It takes the guesswork out of what are the big risks today. What are the known threats? We had in the era of COVID when there was a lot of remote work. Well, we knew that there were a lot of threats regarding phishing scams and ransomware and BYOD issues. These are the things that are being monitored now and will be introduced into the program over time as the landscape changes.
That's beautiful. And let's go back a couple slides to the whole cybersecurity compliance conversation. Security people or security professionals rub with compliance is they're so far behind, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not even mentioning, EDR or whatever it may be, right? They're not forcing us to do any of these things, but we know that these are the real risks. So it sounds like, this is a really way of, closing that gap. You certainly can't be there, right? As things are, 0 day and things like that, but you're certainly getting a lot closer to the contemporary technologies and risk. I think that's, a really smart approach, Mike. That's excellent. Well, that's very, very good. So let's see. Where are we on time? I think instead of just launching into another slide, because we have several more, I think 7 or 8 more, and folks will get those. I think in the next, 3 or 4 minutes, and maybe we can let people even go early. Like, what's a parting message that you would, share with folks that are, considering, HITRUST, for the first time, or maybe they've been doing HITRUST for a while and but they want to expand upon their program. Any type of advice, Mike?
Yeah, I've got tons. So, we'll try and keep it short. don't go it alone.
Okay.
Right. It's really, really important to work with a partner, work with somebody that does this day in, day out, you know, like 360, great example. Don't go it alone, because you're going to spin your wheels and you could waste a lot of time. And there's a lot of tricks of the trade, you know, that organizations can provide you. So have a partner like that at the table with you as early as possible. That would be one. Two, I'll give you three quick ones. Two is leverage your inheritance strategy. Understand what vendors you're using who are going to springboard you, you know, sometimes 50. In the case of the E1, we're seeing 85% inheritance. If you're in Azure, you're in GCP, you're in AWS, it's 15% of things that you need to do. Right? These large CSPs are all certified in a number of other organizations, and you can inherit that and leverage that work. So it's not things that you need to necessarily do. So although it looks like a giant mountain that you have to overcome, it could be a much smaller hill by leveraging an inheritance strategy. And three, don't forget about your own vendors and your own third parties. It's really, really important to make sure you've got an effective third-party risk management program in place, and that's why it's one of the domains of HITRUST. And fun fact, it is the #1 domain that is the weakest or tanks certifications for organizations because they don't have a strong vendor risk management program in place.
Great advice. Ryan, how about for you?
Yeah, you know, I would say is, you know, going back to what Michael was saying is don't go at it alone. You know, pick a partner that also has a vested interest in seeing you succeed. You know, it's make sure that, you know, they have, I like to say they have the hearts of a teacher, you know, and can be able to demonstrate these things and be able to provide the, you know, the guidance needed to be successful in building the program. I think it's also worth mentioning too, HITRUST has the adoption training program too, a course that any organization, anyone can join, and if they're getting started on the HITRUST journey for the first time, that's really a good starting point too. You know, I would say that, you know, don't go at it alone. You know, include a partner who has background and build your relationship from there.
That's fabulous. So I think with that, we are going to give people 2 or 3 minutes back. I would say you look for our communication and let us know how we did. And we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend it with us. We really feel like providing this information to the community is helpful, and we hope you found it to be that way. So we'll see you next month. Thank you, Mike, so much for helping us out, and Ryan, of course, thank you as well.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
See you.